Hey, Dino DVD. I was tagged by Deniz Reviews in a pretty cool video tag on horror movies. It's a horror tag. It's about horror movies, your first experiences, what actor, what director you like, how many horror movies do you have, that type of thing. So your favorite genre and other questions, which I'll get to. But first of all, thanks, Deniz, for the tag. I appreciate it. I did tag you on the coffee tag, so I look forward to your video on that one. You may have already done it. I haven't had a chance to check my channel out yet. But let me do this for you first. And this should be an enjoyable one. So the first question is, how old were you when you first saw your first horror movie? I don't know exactly how old I was, but I'm going to guess 7, 8, something like that. And it would have been a classic horror movie, probably Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, or something like that. I would have seen it on a show that I loved as a child called Monster Movie Matinee, which was on in my area. One of those shows that was popular back then, and even even Elvira had one years later, but where they would actually have a host or hostess introduce a movie, and they still have something like this on Turner Classic Movies, but not so much for horror movies that I've seen. But they'd have a host who would dress up and so on and so forth. And so I'm guessing it was one of those. I don't remember what the first horror movie I ever saw was. I could tell you that as a child, and I actually believe this, as a child, as a young 4-year-old, 5-year-old, I probably saw The Wizard of Oz. And for me, then, that probably was a horror movie because of the witch. I remember as a little kid, I used to have dreams about witches, and I'm convinced that it probably came because the witch looked awful lot like the one from either Snow White, which is another one that you can make some of these cartoons you can make a case when you're very, very little, 4, 5 years old. These movies are scary. Snow White is a scary movie when you think about it. Sleeping Beauty is a scary movie if you think about it. In fact, a lot of these fairy tales were meant to scare children. The original, hence you get something like the Krampus, which I don't know a lot about it, but for what little I've read is the kind of the dark side of this so you have Saint Nick that takes care of the good kids, and then you have the Krampus that takes care of the bad kids. Saint Nick brings presents, or Santa Claus brings presents. The Krampus punishes those children for being bad. So these were legends and fairy tales, and a lot of those were like that. So very young, 8 years old, something like that, when I first saw my first horror movie. And it was probably a black and white one, I'm guessing, because I wouldn't have gone to the theater to see it. And when I was a kid, they didn't have, they had VHS, I guess, but they didn't have, I wouldn't have those in my house. My parents would not have intentionally exposed me to horror films at 7 or 8 years of age. But I went down and watched the television that we had in the basement, the black and white set. I think that's all we had when I was a kid. Anyway, was black and white, and watched that. The Monster Movie Matinee. They were fairly tame, but they were still horror movies. No slashers back then, and no blood and guts, but they were still creepy and scary, and still give you nightmares. So that would be the first horror movie or one of the first horror movies, and I was probably around 7 or 8. Okay, next question is, what is my favorite horror genre? Probably what I would deem to be classic or gothic horror. Probably classic would be a more accurate phrase. Gothic, some of these terms are debatable, depending on who you ask, what Gothic means exactly. To some, Gothic horror might mean Frankenstein. To others, it might have to have a different type of setting, or time period, or general plot to be considered Gothic, from what I've read. So I don't want to, and because there might be a variety of opinions out there as to what Gothic is, I'm going to stick with classic horror films, which to my mind are anything from the 1980s and back. Not anything past, say, about 87, 86, something like that, somewhere in that general range. With some exceptions, don't get me wrong, it's not an exact science here. And more so I would say even more than that, probably for me personally, my classic favorite films would be even, for the most part, pre-'80s. Hammer films, Universal films, some of the other films that came out. You know, I'm a big fan of some of the low-budget films that were made. That didn't have a lot of blood or gore necessarily, but were just well done and kind of spooky and you know, not a lot of special effects or anything, but just were well done. So I guess my favorite genre again is classic. Okay, favorite all-time horror film and why? I just did a listing of my 50 favorite horror films, so anybody who's watched my channel and watched that video would know that my favorite horror film, at least for now, is The Exorcist, the original Exorcist, William Peter Blatty's novel turned into a brilliant film by William Friedkin. I love The Exorcist because it feels real. It feels like it could happen, though clearly it's supernatural. But there's a sense of realism that they put onto this. I mean, there's some character development in that. You know, they didn't jump right into the possession. It happened gradually. There was some other plot development going on. We learned that Reagan's mom is an actress. She is of the Hollywood variety. She is fairly famous. She throws parties. She's fairly well-to-do. She lives in Georgetown in a brownstone, a very nice area, an area where you wouldn't expect something to happen. She doesn't live in a creepy old castle in Transylvania or something like that. You know, it's a setting that is, for the time, modern-day Georgetown, where politicians are and lawyers are and actors and actresses are, and you know, that type of thing. You wouldn't expect that type of thing to happen there, but it does. So I like the plot development. I like the fact that it felt like, you know, it was a real family. There were real issues with the mom and the daughter. She was struggling to try to get help. All those things kind of added up for me. And then being raised Catholic, I'm not currently, but being raised a Catholic, you know, the whole exorcism thing, which is pretty unique to the Catholic Church, but always shrouded in mystery. Yes, it's been done. There's some historical evidence of them. Even in modern times, the Catholic Church doesn't publicize it, doesn't advertise it, but they, even to this day, there's probably being done, I'm guessing. So there's some realism there that they really do get done. There are some stories, allegedly true, about possessions that have come out over the years. Anyway, it had a sense of realism to it. There was a creepiness to it. There was a sense of dread throughout the entire movie. It was well filmed. There were no quote unquote computer tricks in the movie. Well, I shouldn't say that. There were some computer tricks in the movie. Obviously, shouldn't spin her head around. But these things were done mechanically and with very lifelike looking creatures meant to look like the child. So it was just very well done. I liked the plot. I liked the whole idea of the priest, the younger priest who was kind of struggling with his own faith, and the older seasoned priest who comes in to kind of lead the exorcism. Really, really great movie. It's on a lot of people's top lists. I guess it's not a big shocker that it's there. It's a well-reviewed movie. It's a well-regarded movie, I think, by most film goers, whether they be big-time horror fans or just movie fans. A lot of people like The Exorcist, assuming they can watch it and get through it. Favorite actor? Well, I've got a couple. I'm gonna go with Vincent Price. And the reason I like Vincent Price is, you know, he really kind of ran the gamut on some of his roles. You know, he was the kind of the side figure in The Fly, the original Fly, to his brother, but he was there to offer advice. He played a serious role. Yet he played a comical role as well. You know, he had fun with horror, and I think under the right circumstances, that horror and comedy can mix well. I've seen it done very bad. I'm not going to get into that, but I've seen it done badly. At least in my opinion, it's bad. Something I don't care for, and I've seen it done well. And I think Vincent Price did it well. The Abominable Dr. Phibes has got its share of comedic moments. It's certainly not a comedy, but it has some comedic moments. He added a joy and a zeal to the role that helped bring about sort of a campiness to it to some degree, but yet still played as a horror movie. And then he's done others where he was actually absolutely despicable. The Pit and the Pendulum, he's just evil. Now you kind of understand it, but he is what he is. Witchfinder General, he's just bad and very serious in the role. So I just really like the variety. The other one I'll mention is another classic. At least I think both these are classic horror actors, and that's Boris Karloff, who I think did not get enough credit for his brilliant performance of Frankenstein, both in the original, or the Frankenstein monster, obviously, but in the Frankenstein movie and in Bride of Frankenstein, which was really the Bride of the Monster, but I guess you could look at it both ways. It was a bride for Henry Frankenstein as well. Long story, love Boris Karloff. His voice and Vincent Price's voice, both made for horror roles. And of course, Karloff gave us, in addition to Frankenstein, gave us The Mummy, and gave us numerous other performances without the heavy makeup on as well, where he simply his voice and his mannerisms, just as Bela Lugosi's did, as Vincent Price's did, as Christopher Lee's did, really lent themselves to this horror genre. So Vincent Price is my answer. Yeah, notice I've meandered a little bit and wandered on these. Some people like it, some people don't. I'll try to be a little quicker. Favorite director, I'll go with John Carpenter. Of course, I love the Halloween franchise. I think he did a great job, certainly with Halloween 1 and 2. And those movies alone, had he only made those two movies, he'd still have a pretty good reputation in my mind. But he made a lot of other movies as well. And I'll point to Christine, which I thought was the Stephen King novel that was turned into what I think was a great movie, coming out on Blu-ray, by the way, this fall. So I'm going to go with John Carpenter, and I'll just leave it at that. Favorite ending of a horror movie? Well, I like The Exorcist. I've already picked The Exorcist for something. Well, I think I'll go with Bride of Frankenstein. I mean, I could pick Halloween, but I've already mentioned Halloween. So let me pick The Bride of Frankenstein. It's another film I really enjoy. Makes, not that it means it has to, not that the critics are right, but it does make Time Life's list of 100 best movies, not horror movies, best movies, period, of any genre of all time. So that's pretty good. I love The Bride of Frankenstein as a movie. I love that they let the monster talk in the second one. Granted, a very limited vocabulary. And I love his last words to Dr. Pretorius and his would-be bride, the monster's would-be bride. He, first of all, lets Victor Frankenstein, and his bride leave. And then he turns to Pretorius and the bride and says, "We belong dead." And those are the last words he speaks, and the place comes down after that. And we're led to believe they're all dead this time. We thought so in the first movie, but we were wrong. But this time we're pretty sure they're all dead. And I just thought that was a brilliant ending. It was the monster sacrificing himself to rid the world of the bride that rejected him and the doctor that was of the two clearly the evil one, versus Frankenstein, who was not so much. Is it Henry Frankenstein or Victor Frankenstein? Anyway, I could Google it, but someone else will always, and I like when someone pointed out where I was wrong here. I want to say Victor Frankenstein, but then Henry Frankenstein sounds right too. Don't know. Anyway, someone will point that out. I think it's Victor, but let me know. So favorite ending of a movie was The Bride of Frankenstein. Next question is, what horror TV shows or series have you watched? Miniseries, TV series. What haven't I watched? Dark Shadows, American Horror Story, The Walking Dead, The Strain, It, Salem's Lot, The Stand, which we can make an argument that it may not be horror, but Forever Night, you might remember that one with a K. True Blood, which I really liked for like the first 3 or 4 seasons. Then they went into the fairy world, and I was like, eh. But the first 3, maybe 4, I can't remember if it's the first 3 for sure, were really good. And I thought the first season and the second season were brilliant. That one. I've just watched a lot of them. Did I mention Walking Dead? I guess I did. The Walking Dead, The Straight American Horror Story, Dark Shadows, all the miniseries, Forever Night. I have not watched the vampire one. I guess it's got a good-looking guy in the main vampire role. A lot of the women really swoon over him. They wanted him to play the guy in the Twilight movies, which I haven't watched, by the way. Just a ton of TV series. I'm sure there's a lot more. Well, Tales from the Dark Side, if you want to go there, if that's a Masters of Horror. A Night Gallery, which had some horror ones. I guess Twilight Zone had some horror ones. I watched those. The new Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, the original one from the 60s, the one from the 80s as well. In fact, I own a lot of these, as well as watched them both on television in syndication when they were on originally, in some cases, and own many of these things I'm talking about, including Walking Dead and a lot of these other ones. So, yeah, lots, I guess is the short answer. Horror comics I've read. Well, I had at one point a huge, and I still have some in my closet over here. I had a huge collection of eerie, especially, to a lesser extent creepy. Then I also had some, they were like from the 50s. I obviously didn't buy them when they came out, but I had sought them out years later. A lot of these, I can't even think of the name of it. It wasn't creepy or eerie, but there was another series of comics that came out, and most of them, the covers on most of them showed like the scantily clad women being chased by a monster or a werewolf or a vampire or something, and they had a name to them which escapes me right now. I don't know if I have many of those left. Vampirella was another comic that I read fairly regularly, and then there's a whole offshoot of many of those other ones. Just lots over the years. Not so much recent years, so I don't buy a lot of comics. Oh, I don't buy any comics now. The last time I bought comics was probably, I don't know, 15 years ago or something like that. I'm not sure. But I still have a lot, and I can still go back and read them. And I have, I guess my fair share of horror comics. The next one's pretty tough. How many horror movies do I own? It depends. And I say that because it depends how you count them. So here's an example. Here's The Blob, Christine, Fright Night, and The Seventh Sign. Do I count that as 4 or 1? If I count it as 4, then I have about 394 to be exact. And the reason I know that is I didn't count them all, but I have an application on my iPad called DVD Profiler, and it allows anything that's considered the horror genre gets thrown into that, and then I can either count each movie like this to be 1, or I can count it as 4. And counting it as 4, it's about 400. If I don't do that and just count how many individual things, like if I have this, like if I count this as 1 instead of counting it as, would be like 8. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, counting the Rob Zombie ones, which I almost wasn't going to count, but I guess they do. If I count them as 10, it's 400. If I count those as just 1, it's probably more like 200. So, something like that. How many have I watched, you ask? Most of them. I had a wise ass who made a comment, like, these movies, how many have you really watched? Well, a lot of them. I mean, if I look at movies like, let me just take a handful here. I'll just grab a random handful. I've watched The Killers, and in fact, I've watched both versions, both the Don Siegel and the original one by Robert Sidomak. I've watched both versions of this. So, I've watched Joan of Arc. I've watched The Ice Storm a few different times. I've watched Akiru, I don't know how many different times, 5 maybe. I watched Hoop Dreams, I just watched it the other night again, but I've watched it 3 or 4 times. and Hard Boiled I watched while I was out of print twice. So yeah, I watched a lot of them. So take that and shove it up your butt. And I could do that with any stack. I've watched most of them. Does that mean there aren't 30 movies in here that I haven't watched? Oh, there probably are. Now, I may have watched it in the theater, or I may have watched it on television, but I haven't actually watched the actual DVD, or those I did. But I have some others that I haven't watched. Here's 4. I watched these 2 just recently, with this week. Now, I've seen this one before. I haven't seen that one before. I've seen both of these before, but I haven't watched them on this collection. So, whatever. You figure it out. What is the worst horror movie I've ever seen? I've seen some bad horror movies. I've seen some horror movies that I could barely finish. Like I'd fall asleep because they just weren't moving fast. It was just too much exposition, or just no good plot, or whatever. It just was boring to me. Which is hard to do in a horror movie. Most of the time, I may not think it's a great movie, but I'm entertained. I can't say they're boring, which is part of why I like horror. I mean, it does keep you on the edge of your seat, even if it's even if it's the jump scare thing where it's not really the killer, it's a cat in the closet that comes out, but at least it's entertaining. It may not be done the best way I think it could be done, but you know what? I'm not a director. These guys are. They're getting paid for it, so somebody else may love the cat coming out of the closet scaring somebody. Everybody has their own opinions. I'm going to say The Exorcist 2 was, because especially when I contrast it with The Exorcist, my favorite horror film, and you've got The Exorcist 2, The Heretic, which is just dreadful, boring, and they just missed the point of the first one. Now, they made a comeback with the third one, I thought, but the second one is just so bad. Linda Blair, as good as she was as a child in the first one, just not good in the second one. Richard Burton, a good actor, but not so much in this one. The plot was just not great. There was a lot of scenes going back to, I guess it was Africa. I only saw this movie like twice. And actually, I've only seen it in its entirety once, and then I caught it bits and pieces maybe a couple other times. But I have never sat down intentionally to watch it other than the one time, and was very disappointed in it. Yeah, I'm going to say that's probably the worst one. When you think about the budget, when you think about the predecessor especially, I'll say that's the worst horror movie I've ever seen. Now, I've seen some that I can't remember the names of, they were so bad. But of what I can remember, that would be what I would say is the worst. The sickest horror movie I've ever seen. Well, I don't know. It's not technically a horror movie, but Salo, 120 Days of Sodom, is pretty bad. The basic plot there is 4 wealthy aristocrats take a bunch of teenage boys and girls prisoner, and then torture them and finally kill them. Torture them by making them eat feces. Shit, basically. By all sorts, I don't even get into there. All sorts of stuff that you don't want to, but that one scene to me was the one that was the sickest. And then that ties in with my other one that I'll mention, which is the Human Centipede. The first, I never even watched the second one. The first one was bad enough, and I never wanted to see it. I never want to see it again. Some people might enjoy that movie. I don't. I don't find much enjoyable about it. Was it revolting? Yes. Was it repulsive? Yes. Was it sickening? Yes. Did I literally one of those a couple times? Yes. It was disturbing, and if that's the point of horror, I can just follow some accidents around on the highway and see some real death if that's what I want to see. It wasn't, not that there's death in there, it's just the disgusting idea of the whole sewing people together mouth to ass. I mean, it's just bizarre, and I'll give somebody the credit, I guess, for the imagination to even think up the idea, but I wonder about their mind to think up that thought. But it was sick. Probably sicker than Salo in the long run when you come right down to it. But both were bad. I guess if I had to pick the horror movie, it's probably The Human Centipede, because I don't know if Salo qualifies as horror. It's something, but I'm not sure it's horror. So if it's horror, then maybe I pick Salo. But those are two. What horror movie besides my favorite would I recommend to my viewers? Well, I would recommend Rosemary's Baby, Roman Polanski. I would recommend Repulsion, Roman Polanski. I would recommend John Carpenter's Christine. I mentioned that one. I would recommend The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. I go for classic. I would recommend almost anything that Hammer put out in the 60s until they got taken over. There's some wonderful films there that Hammer put out. There's a great collection I have somewhere up there, behind me over here somewhere. The Hammer collection, which has 21 films that were great. A lot of the Christopher Lee Dracula films I recommend if you like vampire movies and classic sort of gothic horror movies. I like a lot of the Universal films, so anything by Universal in the 30s or 40s that's horror related I would enjoy and recommend. I recommend The Invisible Man if you've never seen it. A great movie starring Claude Rains as the voice of the Invisible Man, and eventually the face as well at the very end. But that's a great movie, different but great. So those are a few. What do I think of remakes of the old classics like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Dawn of the Dead, etc.? Not much. Not much at all. To me, if you've got a movie that's as popular and as influential as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was, why would you mess with it? What would you hope to accomplish? The plot isn't all that detailed, so you're not really, there's not a lot to work with there. The beauty of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was how the director was able to get true fear out of actors and actresses who were not really great actors and actresses, and how he was able to create a setting of believability that this could happen, and sort of a primalness to the whole thing. Redoing it with better actors and actresses probably ruins it in some ways. And I'm not saying Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the greatest film I've ever seen, but for what it is, it's very good. And certainly nothing you want to remake. Same with Poltergeist, same with, is it Dawn of the Dead that's getting the remake? I guess it's Dawn of the Dead. That's the one in the mall. Yeah, great movie. Why remake it? It doesn't make any sense to me to remake it. Now, I'm a big fan of Cronenberg's The Fly. It kind of took it to a different level, but most of these movies don't do that. They're just adding some gore. The Fly was kind of a whole other interaction that took place there versus the original one, if you think about it. And the special effects, the CGI that they could do, and the way makeup has changed and everything really allowed them to do much more with that fly than what they, and of course then you could have the brindle fly versus the original one. If you remember, he just had a bag over his head to hide his face, but it was still creepy, the first one. But I like Cronenberg's The Fly, so it's not like it could never happen well. I thought Carpenter's remake of The Thing was very good. I still like the original one, the black and white one, the best. But that's James Arness starred in that one as the what I thought was a carrot monster back when I was a kid. That was one of the early films I watched, by the way. The original, The Thing. Probably on Monster Movie Matinee. That was a scary one when you were a kid. And Carpenter's a scary one now. So anyway, remakes, for the most part, I don't care much about them. With a few exceptions, in the right hands, can be done well. A Cronenberg, a Carpenter, those guys can pull it off. Most directors, they're going to fail miserably. If I could pick one horror movie to watch in the cinema, what would that be? Well, I've seen quite a lot in the cinema. And I don't remember which movie it was that I saw. I saw a movie down in Atlanta years ago. And without getting into the specific demographics of the crowd was great. People were standing up and yelling at the screen, "I wouldn't do that. Don't go in there. You're stupid going in there. What is she doing?" It was wonderful. And the great thing about a horror movie, if you see it with a bunch of people who are vocal, is it enhances the movie. It breaks the tension a little bit if there is, that creepy through the house and let's split up. Well, I wouldn't split up. What are you thinking about splitting up? Are you stupid? You get people yelling like that. I loved that. It's kind of like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, free for all. I love seeing a horror movie when people are doing that. It's almost like they can't help it, or they scream, when something happens. I don't remember what movie it was I saw. I'm going to guess it was like a Halloween or a Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street or something like that. It's been years. Probably when it first came out, I'm guessing. Again, it's been years. It was in Atlanta, so it's probably 20 years ago. Could have been a lot of things, I suppose. Might have even been 30 years ago. Anyway, any of those in the right with the right group are wonderful. If it's a theater, people sitting on their hands that maybe are going to get a couple screams, but they're not going to yell at the screen at all. Maybe something different. I would have loved to have been a kid back in the 30s when they showed the original Wolfman. Because back then that transformation was amazing, probably, They didn't have stuff like that. They didn't have special effects like that. And didn't have monster movies before then. Well, Nosferatu. There was a few exceptions. I would have loved to have been a kid and saw the silent movie of Nosferatu, for that matter. It would have been really cool in the theaters. So anyway, Halloween would be a good choice. Not the original, maybe the fourth or something. Friday the 13th would be fun in the right crowd. Remember, the first one wasn't even Jason. The second one, he didn't even have a hockey mask on. So the third one was the first one with a hockey mask. As iconic as that image is, he's one of the most recognizable faces in horror in the last 30 years, I read somewhere. More so than Michael Myers, more so than Freddy Krueger, believe it or not. Yeah. It's one of those. Nightmare on Elm Street, the first one maybe, would be great in the theater. The first or second Halloween, the originals, not the zombie remakes. I'm not as big. I know a lot of people love the Friday the 13th. I'm not as big a fan of that franchise. I don't even know why. I can't really put my finger on it, but I'm not. One of those probably. All right, Dennis, thank you so much for tagging me. I really enjoyed it. My answers got pretty long-winded here, and I apologize for that, but hopefully someone will enjoy those. They can always fast forward through the ramblings until the next part, maybe. Maybe when I finish this up, I may try to segue those something so there's breaks or something you can see where the breaks are. I don't know. Or maybe I'll just make you suffer and watch the whole thing if you want to see my answers. All right, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And, I got to tag some folks. Well, let me tag Aaron Penn. He seems to be responsive. He did a great one with Hind the other day. She was better than him. No offense, Aaron. But she always is when she participates. She participated in one other one I did. Oh, when I did the What's Wrong with Horror, she was really chiming in, and I thought that was really good, too. So anytime I can get your better half to respond, I'm a happy person there. I'm not on camera, but I mean, she does respond off camera and throw her voice in there. I did appreciate that. On the other tag I gave you on the coffee tag, and also on the long ago one on the horror, What's Wrong with Modern Day Horror. So you are tagged. Let's see. I don't think he was tagged on this one. Loudsburg, tag you. How about Skin Slip? Tag you on this one. Seems like it's up your alley. I may try Cool Duder. He didn't respond to my coffee tag one, but we may give Cool Duder another try. We'll see. If he doesn't respond to this one, I'll stop tagging him. He's a busy boy, but horror's right up his alley, so he may respond to this one. Let's see. Same thing with the Absolute Sublime one. I may give him another shot. It's only been a day, so I'm not going to give up the ghost yet on it. Sammy's really busy these days. I don't know if Falagar has time to do all these, but I'll throw him out that way too. And he'll tag a million other people anyway, so he'll spread the wealth around. So I'll definitely tag him. If he does one, he'll spread it around. I know that much. That's enough. That's enough for my tag. Anyway, guys, take care. This thing's probably 1 million minutes long, but hopefully you enjoy some of it anyway. Take care.